In today's Gospel, we're once again focusing on the Last Supper, this time from the Gospel of Matthew. And once again, there is an emphasis on the betrayal of Christ. And when we think about this betrayal of Christ, it can be very easy to forget that in actual fact, there are two betrayers here. First of all, there is Judas, who sells out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, but then there is also Peter. And Peter betrays Christ 3 times. Now, what's interesting is, though, after these acts of betrayal, these two disciples end up in very different places. Judas obviously ends up taking his own life, an act of total despair and all loss of hope. Peter, on the other hand, who knows full well he has betrayed Christ, remember when the cock crows 3 times, he knows what he's done. But then he returns to the side of Christ. There is a sense of hope in this act of repentance and returning that we see in the life of Peter. Once again, just like yesterday, we are all like Peter. We all betray Christ and we all walk away from him through our sin. But the question is, what do we do at that point? Do we have the hope and the trust in the love of Christ to return to his side like Peter does, or do we leave and wander away in absolute despair? It's very intriguing to see these two disciples on display and the two different responses that we get from them. And you get the sense that the real fundamental key difference here is that Peter has a relationship with Christ, whereas Judas does not. Judas has a relationship with himself, and there's something very interesting in today's Gospel from Matthew that indicates to us how Judas felt about Jesus. He sells Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Now, we often don't understand the significance of that, but 30 pieces of silver is the price that you would pay for a slave. It's a very powerful and profound statement about how Judas views Jesus. Compare that and contrast that to what we saw from Mary just a few readings ago, where she is pouring out this expensive nard perfume on the feet of Jesus. No expense is too great for Christ. But here today we have Judas, and what he is doing is he is effectively treating himself as being greater than Christ is. He is willing to sell him for the price of a mere slave. That indicates to us that the difference here between Peter and Judas is that fundamental relationship with Christ. What Peter has is real and substantial. None of us is perfect, we will all sin. But when that relationship with Christ is real and substantial, in those moments of sin, we recognize it, we might despair over them, but we always return in hope, with repentance and hope for the mercy and love of Christ to be lavished upon us, even if we're clinging in by our bare fingernails, as Peter probably must have been at that point. But Judas, on the other hand, there is no substantial relationship, and when sin enters, so does despair, and he cannot see any other way out of it because he does not truly understand who Christ is and the great mercy and love that he has for all of us. Today's Saint quote of the day comes from Saint Vincent de Paul, and he said this: "The most powerful weapon to conquer the devil is humility, for as he does not know at all how to employ it, neither does he know how to defend himself from it." And really, when you think about it, this is what we see here on display in this betrayal of Christ. We see Judas, who lacks humility. He is willing to sell the Messiah for the price of a slave, not even a king's ransom, just for the price of a slave. And then when he is overcome with guilt for what he's done, he falls into despair and takes his own life. It's almost certain that his pride is driving this despair. Whereas Peter, on the other hand, after he's betrayed Christ, he obviously comes back. Because of that humility, he is able to return to the side of Christ. He doesn't fall into despair. There is still hope. So it is with us. Whenever we find ourselves tempted to act in a way that is prideful, we are imitating Judas. We are imitating that first call of the serpent, Satan, in the garden. You can be just like God. You get to set the agenda. Whenever we act in humility, whenever we surrender ourselves in humble obedience to the call of Christ, we are using the most powerful weapon in our arsenal that we have against Satan.